I want to spend a couple minutes just refreshing our brains about what we've been talking about in chapter 11 because we're about halfway through. So, just a few minute video of everything that we've covered so far in chapter 11. Chapter 11 has been about hypothesis testing. It's different than chapter 10 because in chapter 11 we've been talking about two populations. So, somehow we're comparing two different things. So, maybe we've talked about the average number of pets owned, and maybe we want to compare because we want to open a pet store and we want to try and decide if we want to open it in Bryan or in Archbold. So we might do some sort of hypothesis test about the mean number of pets in both those towns. So we would come up with some sort of claim. Remember, we have our null hypothesis and then our alternative hypothesis. So maybe we wanted to claim that, there's our mu1 that's Bryan, that Bryan has more average number of pets than mu2, which is going to be Archbold. And so then our null hypothesis is going to be the opposite of that, less than or equal to mu2. I apologize, I don't have any fancy Greek letters to work with right now, but you get the idea. So that's what we've been doing in 11.1. Now, within that, we might know sigma. We don't usually, but if we know sigma, we use the z-distribution for that. If sigma is unknown, then we have to make our adjustment to a t-distribution. And then the third one that we talked about is if we had dependent samples. So remember, this is like if you're doing something with your left and right hand, like our tennis ball activity, or if it's a twin study, or if it's a pre and a post test. So if the two populations are like a before and after on the same person, that's when we want to use a dependent sample. And so remember, we take the before and after and we subtract them. And we treat this as just a single population test. And we do a t-test for that. So that's the one that's significantly different, is if it's a dependent. And then the last thing that we talked about is instead of means, if we wanted to compare proportions of something, so if we wanted to compare the proportion of Democrats in Bryan compared to the proportion of Democrats in Defiance or something like that, we would write our null and alternative hypothesis with proportions instead. So maybe we were saying that the proportion of Democrats in Bryan, we'll call Bryan P1, is less than the proportion of Democrats in Defiance, and so then the null hypothesis would be the opposite of that, greater than or equal to. We're just going to use that. So that is what we talked about at the beginning of chapter 11. In the next lessons, we're going to continue kind of along these ideas. Just a reminder, as far as your calculator goes, let's see if I can get the calculator to join the party. There it is. When you go into stats, your stats menu, over to test, we are doing two sample tests, so either a two sample z-test or t-test, depending on if sigma is known or not. If it's a proportion, we're doing a two proportion z-test. And then if it's that dependent one, that's where we're doing just the single t-test, and that's where we use the L3. So hopefully that refreshes your memory a little bit on what we talked about. Feel free to go back and look over your notes, but I think it'll come back pretty quickly to you. I'm going to post several activities, assignments, just to get our brains back before we move on to 11.5.